The trauma bay at Callister Valley Medical Center had never been quieter, and it had never been more dangerous. 43 seconds before 17 crash victims arrived by ambulance, before the doors blew open and the screaming started, before blood hit the floor in 3 different bays simultaneously, the hospital's chief of emergency medicine turned to a nurse no one paid attention to and told her, in front of every resident and tech on shift, that she was an embarrassment to the department. "You don't belong here," Dr. Warren Pruitt said. "You never did." Nurse Lena Caldwell looked at her clipboard, didn't flinch, didn't argue. "Okay," she said quietly. "Can I finish my assessment first?" He took the clipboard from her hand and dropped it on the counter. No one stopped him. No one said a word. That was the last peaceful moment Callister Valley Medical Center would have for the next 14 hours, and the last time anyone in that building would underestimate Lena Caldwell. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where real stories live. Stories about people who were counted out, written off, and left behind. Until the moment came when no one else could do what they could do. Hit the like button if you're already feeling this one, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the moment everything changed. The morning shift at Callister Valley Medical Center started the way it always did, with too many patients, not enough staff, and Dr. Warren Pruitt making his presence known before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. He walked the ER like he owned the floor, the walls, the ceiling, and everyone standing beneath them. 48 years old, silver-templed, with a voice built for grand rounds and a face that had never learned the difference between authority and contempt. He'd been chief of emergency medicine for 11 years. In that time, he had run off 4 nurses, 2 residents, and 1 attending who'd had the nerve to question his discharge decision on a sepsis case. The attending had been right. The patient had coded in the parking lot 40 minutes later. Pruitt had attended the morbidity conference, attributed the outcome to patient non-compliance, and moved on. Nobody pushed back. That was the rule at Callister Valley. You didn't push back on Pruitt. Lena Caldwell had learned that rule the hard way. She'd been at Callister Valley for 8 months, transferred in from a rural contract position in eastern Nevada, and from the first week she arrived, something about her bothered Pruitt in a way he couldn't quite name and didn't try to understand. She was quiet. Not shy quiet, something else. Measured, deliberate. She watched a room the way people watched rooms when they'd spent time in places where watching rooms kept you alive. Pruitt had mistaken that quality for slowness, then for incompetence, and then, once the pattern was established, he simply stopped looking at the evidence. She was assigned to the lower priority triage corridor. Had been for 6 months. The nurses with seniority took the acute bays. Lena got the walking wounded, sprained ankles, minor lacerations, the kind of cases that technically needed attention but didn't demand it. She never complained. She showed up early, stayed late when the board was full, and twice she had quietly flagged patients from her corridor who ended up in the ICU within hours of her note reaching the attending on duty. Both times, Pruitt had attributed the catches to the attending, not to Lena. Both times, Lena had said nothing. It was the 3rd time that changed the temperature between them. 6 weeks earlier, a 52-year-old woman had presented to Lena's corridor with what the intake form listed as generalized fatigue and mild chest discomfort. Standard triage had given her a 4, non-urgent. Lena had walked into that curtain bay, looked at the woman for 30 seconds, and immediately called for a 12 lead. The charge nurse on duty, a practical woman named Darla Fusco, had raised an eyebrow. "She's a 4, Caldwell." "She's diaphoretic and her nail beds are wrong," Lena said. "Just the 12 lead, please." The EKG showed a STEMI in progress. The woman was in the cath lab within 22 minutes. She survived. Pruitt had been furious in a way that made no logical sense until you understood that his problem wasn't that Lena had been wrong. His problem was that she'd been right in a way he hadn't seen coming, and that bothered him more than an error would have. He'd called her into his office and told her that circumventing triage protocol was a liability issue, and that if she did it again without a supervising physician's authorization, he'd document it as insubordination. Lena had looked at him and said, "Understood." She didn't argue. She didn't explain herself. She just said, "Understood," and walked out. and that somehow made it worse. This morning, she was in the break room at 6:47 when her phone buzzed with the shift assignment update. Triage corridor again. She pulled on her badge lanyard, picked up her stethoscope from the locker where she kept it, the same one she'd carried for 11 years, longer than anyone at Callister Valley knew, and walked out onto the floor. The ER was running at about 60% capacity, which for a Tuesday morning in Millhaven, Colorado, was about normal. Millhaven sat at the base of the Rockies in a narrow valley where two state highways intersected, which meant the hospital caught a consistent stream of mountain trauma. Skiing injuries in winter, hiking accidents in summer, and year-round the particular carnage generated by people driving fast roads they didn't respect. The ER had 15 acute bays, a dedicated trauma suite with 2 rooms, a pediatric pod, and the triage corridor where Lena had spent most of the last 6 months. She was reviewing labs on a 12-year-old with a bad asthma presentation when she heard Pruitt's voice carrying down the hall. Caldwell. She turned. He was standing near the nursing station with 2 residents flanking him, both of them young, both of them clearly uncomfortable with whatever was about to happen. Behind him, charge nurse Darla Fusco was pretending to organize the medication cart. "Let's talk about yesterday's shift documentation," Pruitt said. He was holding a printed sheet, her nursing notes from the previous afternoon. She documented a patient's respiratory rate as elevated when the intake form listed it as normal, and had added a clinical note recommending reassessment before discharge. The attending had agreed with her. The patient had been held for observation. Nothing bad had happened, which was the point. "I documented what I observed," Lena said. "You contradicted the intake assessment." "But the intake assessment was done in triage. I observed the patient 40 minutes later. Respiratory rates change." One of the residents looked at the floor. The other looked at Pruitt. "You're not an attending physician," Pruitt said. "You're not a diagnostician. You're a nurse in a triage corridor, and your job is to follow the protocol, document what you're assigned to document, and escalate through appropriate channels. Which means coming to me or to the attending on duty, not inserting clinical opinions into the chart like you have a medical degree." "I documented an observation," Lena said. "That's within nursing scope. Don't do that? Don't document? Don't play word games with me." His voice had dropped, which was somehow worse than when he raised it. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been doing this since you arrived. Second-guessing attending decisions, running your own little assessments without authorization, acting like the rest of us don't know what we're doing." He paused. "It needs to stop. Today. I want a written acknowledgement of the documentation protocol on my desk by end of shift, or we're having a very different conversation about your continued placement here." The residents had both found extremely interesting things to look at that were not Lena Caldwell. Lena held his gaze for a moment. She had eyes that were hard to read, a particular shade of gray-green that didn't give much away regardless of what was happening behind them. Then she said, "Okay, can I finish my current assessment first?" Pruitt's jaw tightened. He reached across the nursing station counter and picked up her clipboard, the one with her in-progress notes on the asthmatic 12-year-old, and set it on the counter on his side. "I'll have someone else cover the corridor," he said. "You've got a report to write." He walked away. The residents followed him. Darla Fusco waited until they were around the corner, then looked at Lena with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and helplessness. "He's been looking for a reason," Darla said quietly. "I know," Lena said. "You okay?" Lena considered the question the way she considered most things, without rushing it. "I need to finish that asthma case first. Can you cover the corridor for 10 minutes? Darla blinked. "He just told you to—" "The kid's peak flow is dropping and he's already on his 3rd albuterol treatment. I need to look at him before I do anything else." Darla glanced down the hall. 10 minutes, she said. Lena went back to the curtain bay. The boy's name was Marcus, 12 years old, brought in by his mother at 5:30 in the morning when his rescue inhaler stopped working. He was sitting upright on the gurney with his elbows on his knees, which any nurse with real experience recognized as a kid working hard to breathe and trying not to show it. His mother was in the corner chair watching him the way parents watch their children when they're frightened but trying not to transmit that fear. "How are you doing, Marcus?" Lena asked. "Better," he said, which was a lie, but a polite one. She put her stethoscope to his back, listened. His oxygen sat at 93, which was acceptable on paper and wrong in context. This was the third treatment in, and the number should have been climbing, not holding flat. She looked at his neck. The accessory muscles were working. "I'm going to talk to the doctor about your treatment plan," she told his mother. "I want to make sure we're getting ahead of this before it gets worse." The mother nodded, the specific nod of a parent who understood that something was being said underneath what was being said. Lena flagged down Dr. Yolanda Marsh, the attending on duty in the pediatric pod, caught her between rooms, and ran through the assessment in about 45 seconds. Marsh nodded, changed the treatment order, added IV magnesium to the protocol, and told Lena good catch. It was not the kind of catch that would ever make a highlight reel. It was just the difference between a kid who got better and a kid who crashed. Lena documented it, left the corridor in Darla's hands, and went to write Pruitt's report. She was halfway through the documentation when the radio crackled. It came through the overhead system first, a burst of static, and then the EMS coordinator's voice, flat and fast in the way voices get when there's a lot of incoming and not enough time. "Callister Valley, this is Millhaven County EMS dispatch. Multi-vehicle collision on Route 9 westbound at the Garnet Pass interchange. 17 confirmed victims, mechanism high energy, semi versus passenger vehicles, at least one rollover, multiple entrapments. First unit ETA 4 minutes. You are receiving all critical and emergent. Secondary overflow to Ridgeline at your discretion. Stand by for patient breakdown." The ER went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then it became a completely different place. The trauma alert system fired. Overhead paging started. People appeared from back hallways and break rooms and supply closets. Nurses tying gowns, residents pulling gloves, techs rolling crash carts into position. The charge nurse called the OR to activate the standby team. Someone was already on the phone with blood bank. Pruitt appeared at the trauma bay entrance looking exactly like a man who needed a crisis to remind everyone why he was in charge. "All right, listen up," he said, and the room gave him its attention the way rooms gave it to authority, whether or not the authority deserved it. "We're treating this as a level 1 activation. I want 2 teams in each trauma bay, pediatric on standby, radiology paged for portable. Caldwell..." He looked around, spotted her coming in from the side corridor, and paused. "You're on logistics. Count supplies. Make sure the secondary corridor is cleared. Stay out of the trauma bays." Lena didn't respond. She went to the supply station and started moving. The first ambulances arrived at 7:06. What came through those doors in the next 6 minutes defied orderly description. Trauma activations had a choreography to them, a rhythm that well-trained teams fell into, each person knowing their role, the noise and motion channeling itself into something purposeful. This one had that quality, briefly, and then it became something else. 17 patients in under 8 minutes was a volume problem that no choreography fully solved. Bays filled, hallways filled. The triage desk stopped triaging and started directing traffic with whatever information was available. Lena worked the secondary corridor, doing what she'd been told, clearing space, inventorying supplies, doing the unglamorous work that kept the machinery running. She was fast and quiet and efficient, and she noticed things as she moved. She noticed a paramedic she didn't recognize wheel in a gurney with a child on it and divert toward the pediatric pod. She noticed the child's age, maybe 8 or 9, and the injury description on the visible trauma tag. Forehead lac, GCS 15, ambulatory at scene, minor. The paramedic was telling someone the kid had been in the back seat, no airbag deployment on the passenger side, conscious and talking at scene. She was 6 feet away, moving past with an armload of IV supplies, when she stopped. The boy was sitting up on the gurney, small, maybe 60 pounds, dark hair matted with blood on the left side from a forehead laceration that had already been field dressed. He was conscious, eyes open, tracking. GCS 15. Talking to the paramedic, answering questions. Everything about him said minor, except the way he was breathing. It was subtle. The kind of subtle that didn't show up on a trauma tag, didn't register in a field assessment when you had 16 other patients and you were moving fast and the kid was talking and his vitals were written as stable. The breathing was a little shallow, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Lena was looking for it. She set down the IV supplies. She crossed to the gurney, and the paramedic looked at her with mild surprise, and she said, "Can I look at him for a second?" The paramedic shrugged. They were already turning to leave, another unit calling for help outside. "He's going to pediatrics. Lack repair, OBS for concussion. He's stable." "Yeah," Lena said. "1 second." She looked at the boy. "Hey, what's your name?" "Cody," he said. His voice was normal. His eyes were clear. "Cody, does your stomach hurt?" A pause. Brief. He looked at his lap. "A little." "Where?" He touched his left side, just below the ribs, without really thinking about it. The gesture of a kid reporting something that hadn't fully registered as significant yet. Lena put her hand on his abdomen, gently, flat-palmed. He flinched, not dramatically, just a small involuntary tightening. She looked at his skin. The forehead lock had bled dramatically the way forehead locks did, and the blood had drawn all the attention. But his left side, beneath the torn shirt, there was something there. A spreading discoloration that hadn't fully developed yet, the kind that took time to appear after blunt trauma, the kind that was easy to miss if you were focused on the obvious wound above it. She checked his capillary refill on his left hand. Slow, not alarmingly so. Borderline. She straightened up. "He needs imaging," she said, to no one in particular and everyone in range. "Abdominal ultrasound, now." The nearest resident, a second-year named Dr. Paige Aller, looked up from a chart at the nursing station. "He's already been assessed. He's going to—" "I know where he's going," Lena said. "I'm telling you he needs an ultrasound first." "Caldwell." Pruitt's voice came from the trauma bay entrance, 20 feet away. He'd heard her, or someone had flagged him. He walked over, his expression carrying the specific weight of a man who had been interrupted during a crisis he was managing and had found the interruption predictable. "What are you doing?" "This child has left-sided abdominal tenderness and developing flank discoloration. He needs a fast exam before he goes to OBS." Pruitt looked at the boy, looked at the trauma tag. "GCS 15, ambulatory at scene, mechanism documented as low-energy passenger compartment." He touched his left side without prompting, and his capillary refill is borderline on the left hand. His vitals are stable. Vitals can lie for 20 minutes after splenic injury. You know that. The word splenic landed in the air between them. Pruitt's face changed. Not much. A small hardening around the eyes that had nothing to do with clinical assessment and everything to do with the fact that she had just said splenic injury in front of a resident and 2 nurses and a paramedic who was still within earshot, which meant that if she was right, everyone would know it, and if she was wrong, he would make sure everyone knew that too. "He's going to pediatric observation," Pruitt said. "That's the protocol for this presentation. If his clinical picture changes, the OBS team will escalate. By the time his clinical picture changes, he could be in hemorrhagic shock." "You are not a physician." The words were deliberate, measured, loud enough to carry. "You are a nurse who is assigned to logistics. I need you to go back to that assignment right now, or I will end your shift and begin formal proceedings this afternoon. Are we clear?" The hallway was not exactly quiet. Trauma bays were still in motion. Someone was calling for another unit of ONEG down the corridor. But the people nearby had gone very still. Lena looked at Pruitt. Then she looked at Cody, who was watching both of them with the uncertain expression of a child who understood that the adults around him were in conflict and wasn't sure what that meant for him. Then she looked at Dr. Paige Aller, who was 26 years old and 8 months into her residency, and who was looking at Lena with something in her face that wasn't quite courage yet, but was trying to become it. "Dr. Aller," Lena said, "will you order the fast exam?" Aller looked at Pruitt. Pruitt said nothing, just waited. Aller's jaw worked. She was doing the math, the professional math, the risk math, the math of a young physician who had not yet fully learned which calculations mattered more than others. "I'll order it," Aller said. Pruitt's expression didn't change. "Dr. Aller, I'd like to see you in my office after—" "I'll order the fast exam," Aller said again, and her voice was steadier the second time. Pruitt walked back toward the trauma bays without another word. The temperature of the hallway came down a fraction. Lena went to find the ultrasound machine herself because the sonography tech was occupied in Trauma Bay 2 and the portable unit was available and she knew how to use it, had used it in conditions where there was no power and no tech, and the machine was propped on a vehicle tailgate in 90-degree heat with artillery in the middle distance. She didn't think about that. She just found the machine and wheeled it over. "This might be a little cold," she told Cody. "Okay," he said. He was still watching her with those careful, uncertain eyes. She applied the gel and placed the probe. What the screen showed in the next 40 seconds was not subtle. Free fluid, left upper quadrant, more than incidental. A dark crescent around the spleen, then below it, pooling. She moved the probe. The spleen itself, the image was clear enough. The contour was wrong. She called it calmly. The way you called things when the situation required calm and panic was a luxury you weren't going to spend. "Dr. Aller, come look at this." Aller crossed to the machine and looked at the screen and went very still. "Is that—" "Yes," Lena said. Aller reached for her radio. "Down the hall in Trauma Bay 1, Doctor. Warren Pruitt was coordinating care for a 40-year-old with a fractured pelvis and a pneumothorax and the specific performance of a man managing a crisis well. He didn't hear the call go out for the surgical team. He didn't hear the Trauma Bay designation change. He didn't see the gurney with the small boy being moved fast down the corridor toward the elevator, Lena Caldwell's hand on the rail. He didn't see any of it. But the boy's blood pressure, which had been sitting at 98/64 and trending in a direction that now made terrible sense, dropped to 81/50 in the elevator. The surgical team was already scrubbed. When the elevator opened, and they moved Cody down the corridor at the kind of speed that made everyone standing in the hallway press themselves against the wall without being asked. Lena ran alongside the gurney for the first 30 feet, relaying the fast findings to the circulating nurse in the clipped sequential shorthand she had learned in a language that had nothing to do with hospital hallways. Free fluid left upper quadrant, suspected splenic laceration, BP dropping, no IV access above the antecubital on the right, the left arm was better. The circulating nurse was already relaying it ahead. The anesthesiologist met them at the OR suite door. Lena stopped at the line on the floor where the corridor ended and the sterile environment began. She wasn't scrubbed. She wasn't credentialed for this room. She stood at that line and watched them take Cody through the doors, and then the doors swung shut and there was nothing left to do but go back. She stood there for a moment, just a moment. Then she turned around. The ER below was still running hot. She could hear it from the stairwell. The overlapping voices, the equipment alarms, the particular percussion of a department managing more than it was built to handle. She took the stairs instead of the elevator because the elevator was slower, and she had learned a long time ago that stairs were always faster when it mattered. Dr. Paige Aller was waiting at the bottom of the stairwell door, which surprised Lena because Aller had no particular reason to be there and several good reasons not to be. "He's in surgery?" Aller asked. "Yes." "His BP was 81/50 in the elevator. The team knows." Aller let out a breath. She was young enough that she hadn't yet learned to do that quietly. "Pruitt saw the imaging request go through. She stopped, started again. "He came to the nursing station and asked who authorized the fast. Darla told him it was a physician order." "It was," Lena said. "You ordered it. He knows it wasn't his idea." That was never going to be a secret. Aller looked at her. There was something she was working up to saying, and Lena waited for her to get there. "Why didn't you just go around him from the start? You could have called the attending in PEDS directly. You could have—" "Because that's not how it works," Lena said. "You go around people, and they find another reason to sideline you. You make the case in the room, on the record, in front of witnesses. That way, when you're right, everyone knows it." Aller absorbed that. "And when you're wrong, then everyone knows that too, but you have to be willing to be wrong in public if you want to be right in public." Lena pushed open the stairwell door. "Come on, we still have 16 other patients." The ER had not calmed down. It had simply reorganized its chaos into something that looked, from a distance, like function. 3 of the original 17 patients had been admitted to the ICU. 2 were still in the trauma bays with active interventions. The rest were distributed across the acute bays and secondary corridors in various stages of assessment and treatment. And the board was a color-coded grid of complexity that would have taken a full afternoon to untangle under normal circumstances. Pruitt was back at the center of it, which was where he functioned best, in the middle of a managed crisis, giving orders that people followed because the alternative was paralysis. Lena would give him that. In the controlled chaos of a multi-casualty event with defined parameters, he was competent. He knew how to triage resources. He knew how to sequence decisions. He knew how to project the kind of authority that kept a department from fracturing under pressure. What he was not good at was being wrong. He saw Lena come back onto the floor, and he watched her for exactly 3 seconds before he turned back to the board. He didn't say anything. That absence of words was its own kind of thing. Not a concession, not a backing down, just a temporary tactical silence that she recognized for what it was. He was waiting for the outcome. If Cody made it through surgery and the imaging confirmed what Lena had found, Pruitt would frame it as a system success. The team had caught a missed injury, protocols had functioned, escalation had worked. He would not say her name. If something went wrong in that OR, he would say her name. She went back to work. The secondary corridor had 3 new patients from the accident who'd been routed there after the acute bays filled. 2 adults with orthopedic injuries and a teenage girl with a head lack and probable concussion who was sitting up and texting on a cracked phone with the focused determination of someone who had decided that being injured was not going to interrupt her morning. Lena assessed her first because the phone was a good sign, but the left pupil was a fraction sluggish on direct light, and she flagged it for the neuro-PA on duty without making a production of it. She worked through the corridor patients efficiently, the way she did everything, without wasted motion, without narrating her own process, just moving from one thing to the next. She changed a dressing on a 50-year-old man who had a forearm lek that needed suturing and was catastrophically afraid of needles, and she talked him through it by asking him about his truck, which he'd mentioned in passing, and which turned out to be a subject he could discuss at length and with great precision while a needle went through his skin. By the time she was tying off the last suture, he'd given her a detailed breakdown of the transmission rebuild he'd done the previous fall and hadn't noticed the procedure was complete. An hour into the organized recovery phase, Darla found her between patients. Darla's face had the look of someone delivering news they hadn't asked to carry. "Pruitt pulled your file," Darla said. Lena was documenting. She didn't look up. "Okay." He has been in his office since the surge calmed down. He had HR on the phone 20 minutes ago. "I know." "Lena." Darla waited until Lena looked at her. "He can do it. He has enough documented warnings to put you on a PIP and push for termination before the end of the month. The fast thing. Even if the kid does fine, Pruitt can frame it as a nurse overstepping scope. The order was Allers, not yours. On paper, you just wheeled a machine somewhere you weren't supposed to be. I know how it looks on paper. Do you care?" It was a real question. Darla had been a charge nurse for 16 years, and she'd watched people burn themselves down for patients who never knew their names, and she'd watched people survive by learning when to pick their battles. She wasn't judging, she was asking. Lena considered it honestly. "I care about the outcome," she said. "The rest of it," she set down the documentation tablet. "The rest of it is what it is." Darla shook her head, not in disagreement exactly, more in the resigned admiration you had for people who'd decided on a particular way of being in the world and weren't going to change it. "He's going to make your life difficult." "He already has," Lena said. "It hasn't stopped me yet." The call from the OR came at 9:47. It came to Darla's station, which was where surgical updates typically landed during a busy shift, and Darla took it and wrote down 2 things on a notepad and then walked directly to where Lena was sitting in the break room eating half a granola bar she'd found in her jacket pocket because she hadn't eaten since 5 in the morning. Darla put the notepad on the table in front of her. It said, "Cody. Grade 3 splenic lac. Repaired. Stable. PICU." And then below that, in Darla's handwriting, "Surgeon said another 20 to 30 minutes and it would have been grade 4 or rupture. Lena read it. She read it again. Then she finished the granola bar. Does Pruitt know? She asked. The OR called up to the surgical suite, SAS, and to the department chief simultaneously. Standard protocol. So, yes, he knew. Lena sat with that for a moment. Not satisfaction exactly. It wasn't a feeling that had a clean name. The child was alive and would stay alive, and that was the thing that mattered. And underneath that was something older and more complicated. The particular exhaustion of being right in a way that cost you something, and knowing that the cost wasn't finished yet. She went back to the floor. The afternoon shift began to filter in around noon, and the morning team started the handoff process. The long, imperfect transfer of information that was always incomplete and always necessary. Lena ran through her corridor patients methodically, giving each handoff report the same attention regardless of whether the case was complex or simple, because the simple ones had a habit of becoming complex when you weren't looking. She was finishing her last handoff when Pruitt appeared in the corridor. He wasn't carrying anything, wasn't looking at a chart. He walked toward her with the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to say and how they were going to say it, and the two residents who'd been following him all day had been left behind somewhere, which meant this wasn't a performance. This was just him. "My office," he said. "Now." She followed him. His office was small for someone with his title, a consequence of the hospital's renovation priorities, which had given the department a new simulation lab and not a new administrative wing. He had a desk, 2 chairs, a wall of binders that she suspected hadn't been opened in years, and a window that looked onto the parking structure. He sat behind the desk. She sat in the chair across from him. Neither of them moved to close the door, which meant this was either an oversight or a choice, and she suspected it was a choice on his part. A room with an open door was a room with witnesses to whatever he said next. "The surgical outcome is good," he said. "That's the most important thing." "Yes," she agreed. "The process that got us there involved a number of procedural irregularities. I found a child who needed imaging. A physician ordered the imaging. The imaging showed what I thought it would show. You operated outside your assignment. You engaged with a patient you had no documented responsibility for. You conducted an ultrasound assessment without physician supervision. I showed Dr. Oller the images. She made the clinical determination. After you'd already run the probe." "Yes." Pruitt leaned back in his chair. He had a way of doing this, a calculated physical relaxation that was supposed to read as authority, and sometimes did. "I'm going to be honest with you, Caldwell. This isn't about today. Today is a data point and a pattern. You've been here 8 months, and in 8 months you have consistently—" He chose the next word carefully. "Exceeded the boundaries of your role, in ways that sometimes produce good outcomes, and sometimes create liability exposure and always create friction. I've documented every clinical concern through appropriate channels. You've documented them after acting on them. That's not the same thing." He paused. "You have a prior record at your last placement?" She kept her face neutral. "I had a difference of opinion with an administrator about staffing ratios. You filed a complaint with the state nursing board." "I did." "That's not a difference of opinion. That's—" He stopped. Reset. "The point is, this isn't a pattern that developed here. You came here with it. And I've been patient because your clinical skills are—" Another pause. She noticed he had trouble completing sentences when the sentences required him to acknowledge something he didn't want to acknowledge. "Adequate, but patience has a limit." "I understand." "Do you?" He looked at her directly. "Because I need you to understand something specific. This hospital operates as a system. That system depends on people performing their defined roles. When individuals decide that their personal assessment supersedes the structure, the whole thing becomes unpredictable. Unpredictability costs lives." "Or saves them," Lena said, "depending on who's doing the assessing." His jaw tightened. "I'm placing you on administrative review, effective today." She nodded once. "That means you're off the floor pending HR review of today's events. You'll receive documentation by end of business." If the review board determines the procedural irregularities were outside acceptable variance, we'll move to formal disciplinary proceedings. He pulled a folder from a desk drawer and set it on the desk in front of her without handing it to her. You're welcome to have union representation. That's your right. Thank you, she said. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. He said, "That's all." She stood. She went to the door. "Caldwell." She turned. Pruitt looked at her with something in his face that was harder to categorize than anything he'd said. Not contempt exactly, not satisfaction exactly, something more uncomfortable than either. "Why didn't you just come to me?" She understood the question. He was asking it sincerely, which surprised her slightly. "I did come to you," she said. "You told me to go back to logistics." She left. The locker room was empty. She changed out of her scrubs, folded them, put her stethoscope in her bag. The same stethoscope she'd carried for 11 years. She sat on the bench for a moment, not collapsing, just sitting. The deliberate pause of someone who knew the difference between stopping and resting. Her phone had 3 missed calls, all from the same number, which she recognized but hadn't expected to see today. She looked at it for a moment, then put the phone in her bag and stood up. She walked out of the hospital through the ambulance bay, not the main entrance, because the main entrance had 2 journalists and a local news camera that had arrived somewhere in the middle of the morning shift and hadn't left. Someone had talked, probably several someones. 17-vehicle crash on a mountain highway produced a particular kind of public attention, and Callister Valley Medical Center was going to be in the regional news cycle for the next several days, which meant Pruitt was going to be doing interviews, and the hospital's communications team was going to be managing the narrative, and none of that was her problem to deal with right now. The afternoon air was cold the way Colorado afternoons were cold even in late spring. A dry, high-altitude cold that felt different from any other cold, cleaner somehow, with the smell of pine coming down from the ridge. She stood in the ambulance bay for a moment and breathed it. Then she got in her car. She drove back to her apartment, which was a 12-minute drive through Mill Haven's downtown and up the west side of the valley to a building that wasn't much, but had a view of the mountains from the kitchen window that she'd decided was worth whatever else the building lacked. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She called the number back. It rang twice. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 14 months said, "Harper." Not Caldwell. Harper. Her name, her actual name. The one on the documents that no civilian personnel file had ever seen. She'd changed her name legally, had done it through channels that the Army had arranged, and the reasons for that were layered and specific, and not something she'd walked through with anyone in Mill Haven or at Callister Valley or anywhere else in the last 3 years. "Briggs," she said. "We've been monitoring," the voice said. "You had a good day." "I had a complicated day." Complicated is relative. A pause. "The Mill Haven situation is on radar. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She looked out the kitchen window. The mountains were in full afternoon light, the snow line still visible on the upper ridges. "What does that mean?" "It means people are paying attention, the kind of people who don't show up in civilian after-action reports." "Briggs." "I know," he said. "I know that's not what you want to hear. What I want to hear is nothing. I've been doing nothing for 3 years and it's been working." "It's been working for you," he said. "It hasn't been working for us. And there's a situation developing that—" He stopped. She could hear him deciding how much to say. "There's a situation developing that involves your specific skill set in a way that nothing else addresses." "My skill set is nursing triage," she said. "I found a splenic lac in a kid that someone else missed. That's not a military asset." "The splenic lac is the least interesting thing about today." His voice was steady, carefully neutral. "Lena, we need to talk in person." She didn't answer right away. Outside, a hawk was circling something above the tree line, patient and specific, doing exactly what it was built to do. "I'm on administrative review," she said finally. "My schedule just opened up." "I'll be in Mill Haven tomorrow morning," Briggs said. She ended the call. She sat with the coffee, which had gone lukewarm while she wasn't paying attention. She drank it anyway. She didn't sleep much that night, not because she was anxious, exactly. Anxiety was a luxury she'd learned to convert into something more useful a long time ago. She lay in the dark and she thought about Cody, who was in the PICU right now, with his spleen repaired and his blood pressure normal, and his mother sitting in the chair beside him the way his mother had been sitting in the chair when Lena walked into that curtain bay 12 hours ago. She thought about Paige Aller, who had made a decision in a corridor this morning that had nothing to do with protocols and everything to do with what kind of doctor she was going to be. She thought about Pruitt and the folder on his desk, and the specific kind of institutional machinery that was now in motion. She thought about the name Briggs had not said on the phone, the situation, the skill set that nothing else addressed. She knew what it was before he said it, in the same way she'd known about Cody's spleen before the ultrasound confirmed it. Not certainty, but the particular convergence of details that experience organized into something you couldn't quite call a guess anymore. She was up before 5, made breakfast, looked at the mountains in the early light, which was a gray-violet color that lasted about 12 minutes before it turned gold. At 6:53, her building's intercom buzzed. She pressed the answer button. Yes, Major Harper. The voice was not Briggs, it was younger, formal. Colonel Briggs sends his apologies. He was diverted last night. There's been a development. She pressed the door release. She stood in her apartment and waited, and when the knock came, she opened it, and there were 2 people in the hallway. A young man in civilian clothes who had military in every line of his posture, and a woman in her 50s whose face she recognized from a briefing she'd sat in on 4 years ago in a building in Virginia that didn't officially exist. The woman said, "We need you back, Lena. The situation isn't waiting." And Lena looked at her and said the only thing that was true. What happened? The woman's expression was the expression of someone who had driven through the night to deliver information they couldn't send electronically, which meant the information was either classified above standard channels or dangerous enough that it couldn't sit in a system. And either way, it meant that whatever had been developing in the background of Lena's carefully constructed ordinary life had just arrived at her front door with no intention of leaving. 4 hours ago, the woman said, a military medical convoy in the Garnet Range was ambushed. 6 casualties. 2 of them are people you trained. Lena didn't ask which 2. She already knew that if she asked, the answer would change something she wasn't ready to have changed yet. And she needed 30 seconds to be a person who didn't know before she became a person who did. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. They came in. The young man closed the door behind them and positioned himself near it without being asked, which was a habit so ingrained it had stopped being a conscious choice. The woman, her name was Voss, Diane Voss, and her title had changed 3 times since the Virginia briefing, but her function had not. Moved to the kitchen table and sat down like someone who had been awake for a long time and was making a tactical decision about where to put her body. Lena sat across from her. "Tell me." MAST-7 was running a route through the Garnet Range backcountry, Voss said. "Medical Assistance Support Team. You helped design the protocol. They were moving 2 civilian contractors with injuries from a site access accident, plus 4 military personnel. The convoy was 3 vehicles. At approximately 0200 local, the lead vehicle hit a device on an unpaved service road at 3,100 meters elevation. The blast disabled the vehicle and the team leader. The second vehicle took fire from the ridge. Third vehicle was able to pull back, but one of the personnel in the second vehicle was already down. What's the access situation? Weather moved in after the incident. Ceiling is too low for medevac. Ground teams are 4 to 5 hours out by the fastest available route, and the road the convoy was using is now compromised. Lena processed this. Communications? Intermittent. The team has a working satellite unit, but terrain is blocking consistent uplink. We've had 2 contact windows in 4 hours. Who's running it on the ground? Voss looked at her steadily. Sergeant First Class Daria Moss. That was one of the 2 names. Lena had trained Moss in a converted airplane hangar in Nevada 18 months before she'd left the program. A 29-year-old from Baton Rouge who'd come to the medical track from combat engineering and who had an aptitude for field trauma that Lena had noted in writing and submitted up the chain because it was the kind of aptitude that needed to be on record. Moss had been one of the last people Lena had worked with before everything changed. The second casualty? Lena asked. Corporal Wade Tillman, chest. He was in the second vehicle when it took fire. Tillman was 23. She remembered him because he'd been the worst student she'd ever had in the first 3 weeks of the course, and the best student she'd ever had by the end of it. And the gap between those two versions of himself was the most dramatic clinical development she'd seen in a training environment. She'd written that up too. She stood up, went to the window. The mountains were gold now, the 12-minute gray-violet finished and gone. "What do you need me to do?" "We have a relay station 60 kilometers from the incident site. There's a communications specialist there who can maintain uplink with Moss for up to 40 minutes at a time if the weather holds. What we need," Voss paused, choosing words with the care of someone who understood that how you asked for something affected whether you got it. "What we need is someone who can talk Moss through what Tillman needs, chest trauma, at altitude, with what she has in those kits, in those conditions. You have medical personnel at Bragg who can—" "Moss won't respond to Bragg," Voss said. "We tried. First contact window, we put her through to the trauma desk. She answered 3 questions and went quiet. She needs someone she trusts." Lena understood that completely. "What does the kit have?" "Standard mass loadout, plus 2 units of freeze-dried plasma and a surgical airway kit." "Needle decompression supplies?" "Yes." "Chest seal?" "High-fine vented, 2 packs." She was already running it, the specific arithmetic of altitude-modified chest trauma, the variables that changed above 3,000 meters, the way hypoxia compounded hemorrhage, and how the treatment sequence shifted as a result. It was a different calculation than sea-level trauma, and not everyone knew how different. "How long has Tillman been down?" "Approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. 4 hours. With a chest injury, at altitude, in cold that she could calculate from the elevation and the time of year to a range that was not forgiving. "Get me the relay station," she said. "There's a vehicle downstairs," Voss said, already standing. The drive took 41 minutes. The relay station was not what the name implied. It wasn't a building with equipment inside, so much as a reinforced trailer on a service road that the Forest Service used in summer for fire monitoring, perched on a ridge at 2,200 meters with a direct line of sight to a gap in the range that allowed intermittent satellite bounce. The communications specialist was a young man named Torres, who was already at the console when they arrived, and who had the focused, slightly haunted look of someone who'd been managing a bad situation for hours and was running on the adrenaline that came from responsibility without power. "Next window in 8 minutes, Torres said, without turning around. "Terrain weather is moving. It might be the last clean window for 6 hours. Lena sat down in the second chair and put on the headset. She looked at the console and asked Torres 2 quick questions about the signal quality and the delay, and he answered them accurately, and she adjusted her expectations accordingly. She waited. 7 minutes was a long time to wait with the right information and the wrong options, and she spent it pulling every detail she'd retained about the mast kit configuration, about the Garnet range elevation profile, about Daria Moss's specific training gaps and strengths. Moss was exceptional at hemorrhage control and weak on tension pneumothorax recognition. Not dangerously weak, but it had been the one area where Lena had pushed her hardest in training, because it was the thing that killed people in the field when everything else went right. The console crackled. Torres said, "Windows open, 60% signal, go." Lena keyed the mic. "Moss, this is Harper, talk to me." Static. Then a voice that was recognizable but stripped down to its functional components. Flat, fast, controlled in the way people controlled themselves when control was the only tool they had left. "Harper, he's bad. Breathing it's wrong. Right side. I've got the seal on, but his SAT's been dropping for the last hour." "What's the SAT number?" 84. 84 at 3,100 meters was critical. The altitude math was unforgiving. Effective oxygen at that elevation was already diminished, and a SAT of 84 in those conditions was worse than a SAT of 84 at sea level by a margin that mattered. "Is the seal vented or occluded?" "Vented. Take it off." A pause. "What?" "Take it off and listen to me. Right side tension is building despite the seal. The vent isn't keeping up with the rate. Unseal it, position him sitting at 45 degrees if you can, and tell me what his trachea is doing." She heard movement, heard Moss speaking to someone else. A voice she didn't recognize, probably one of the other personnel managing the perimeter or the other casualties. Then, trachea looks, it might be shifting. Left. Maybe. Breath sounds on the left? Present. Right side is a pause. Diminished. Really diminished. Okay, you're going to decompress the right side. Do you have the 14 gauge? Yes. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. You've done this. In training, same thing. The anatomy doesn't know you're scared. A beat. Moss. You've done this. Silence on the line. Lena counted it. 3 seconds, 4, 5, and then she heard the sound of someone moving with purpose, and then a sharp intake of breath from Moss, and then in. Rush of air? Yes. Yes. Leave it. Do not remove the needle. Tell me his color. Another pause. Better. His color is better. Lena let out a breath that she'd been holding without quite deciding to hold it. His SAT is going to take a few minutes to respond. Keep him at 45 degrees. He needs to stay still. What's his level of consciousness? He's in and out. He was talking 30 minutes ago. Now he's... Moss's voice shifted. A fraction. Just enough. He keeps asking me if we're going to be okay. What are you telling him? I'm telling him yes. Good. That's the right answer. Lena checked the time on the console. Moss, the plasma. Have you run it? 1 unit in. Couldn't get the second line. Where did you try? Antecubital both arms. Couldn't thread it in the cold. Hands aren't working right. External jugular. You have the supplies. It's not your first choice, but it's what you've got, and he needs volume. A longer silence this time. Torres was watching the signal meter. It was holding at 58%, which was good enough. I don't, Moss started, stopped. I haven't placed an EJ in the field. You placed one in the simulator, same thing. The simulator didn't have a 30-mile-per-hour wind, and my hands didn't... Moss. Lena's voice didn't change in volume or tone, but something in it shifted. A quality that she couldn't have named and didn't need to, because it worked without being named. It had always worked. Tillman is cold, and he's losing volume, and the plasma you already ran bought him time, not a solution. The EJ is the solution. You can do this. She heard Moss breathing, just breathing. The deliberate, controlled breathing of someone who is scared and managing it. Okay, Moss said. Okay. Talk me through it. Lena talked her through it. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which Torres watched the signal meter and Voss stood near the door and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would improve on silence. Lena walked Moss through the landmark identification, the needle angle, the J-wire technique, patient, specific, without rushing, because rushing was what killed people in procedures done under pressure. She corrected twice, once when Moss reported the angle wrong, and once when she heard Moss's breathing go shallow in a way that meant she was holding too much tension in her hands. Relax your grip, Lena said. You're fighting the needle. Let it move. A sound, then, it's in. It's in. Flash in the hub? Yes. Thread the wire. More sounds, then, wires through. Catheter over the wire, slowly. The signal meter dropped to 42%. Torres made a small sound and adjusted something. It came back to 49. Catheter's in, Moss said. I'm taping it. Start the second unit now, wide open. Starting. A pause. Harper. His color is better. His breathing is easier. Lena said, Good work, Moss. It was not an effusive statement. It was exactly what it was, a specific acknowledgement of a specific thing done correctly under conditions that made correct things difficult. Moss knew the difference. Ground team is 4 hours, Lena said. You need to maintain his airway and monitor for reaccumulation on the right side. If his breathing deteriorates again, the needle may have kinked. You'll need to place another. Do you have more 14s? 2 more. Then you have what you need. What are your other casualties' status? Moss ran through it. 3 others with injuries ranging from orthopedic to head lac. None immediately life-threatening, all stable for now, though stable was a relative term at altitude with no shelter beyond the vehicles and a temperature that had dropped 4 degrees since the incident. One of the civilian contractors had a femur fracture that was going to become a serious pain management problem in the next 2 hours. Lena was in the middle of running through a traction protocol when the signal dropped. Not gradually, just dropped. Torres made a sharp movement at the console and then sat very still, which was its own kind of answer. Window? Lena asked. Closed. Weather moved faster than the model. He was already working. Next estimated window is... He checked something. Minimum 4 hours. Could be 6. The trailer was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it against the metal walls. A low, sustained sound that meant the weather system that had closed the window above was moving through. Voss said, Moss knows what to do. She knows what to do for the next hour, Lena said. After that depends on Tillman. The ground team? 4 hours minimum, off-road at altitude in deteriorating weather. Lena looked at the useless console. That's not 4 hours for a stable patient. That's 4 hours for a patient who just had a tension pneumo-decompressed in the field by someone who's never done it live, at 3,100 meters, with 1 unit of plasma and a kinked 14-gauge needle in his chest. Voss was quiet. Lena stood up. She needed to move, needed to put her body in motion because motion was the thing she'd learned to trust when thinking ran out of road. She walked to the door and opened it, and the wind hit her, cold and sharp and specific, and she stood in it for a moment. She had a thought. It was not a comfortable thought. She turned around. What's the ridge access from here? She asked Torres. Torres looked at her. To what? To the incident site, by ground. What's the fastest route that doesn't use the compromised road? Torres blinked. He pulled up something on a secondary screen, a topographic overlay. There's a fire access trail from the ridgehead that comes down the north face. He squinted. 14 kilometers. Rough terrain. The last 2 are technical. You'd need... What vehicle do we have? Voss said. Lena. What vehicle? A Forest Service ATV and a military transport. The transport can't handle the North Face Trail. A TV can, Torres said carefully. It can handle most of it. The last section is on foot. How long? He ran the calculation. 2 hours, maybe 2.5. If you know the terrain and you're moving fast. She didn't know the terrain, but she knew how to move through terrain she didn't know, which was a different skill set and a more useful one. Voss, she said, I need a pack, whatever medical supplies you have in the vehicle. And I need someone who knows the North Face Trail. I can't authorize... You drove 6 hours through the night to get me because no one at Bragg could talk Moss through a chest decompression. You can authorize a 2-hour ATV ride. Voss looked at her. There was a calculation happening behind her eyes, the kind that Lena recognized because she'd seen it on a lot of faces over the years, the calculation of someone weighing what was sanctioned against what was necessary. Torres, Voss said, do you know the North Face Trail? Torres said, my uncle runs cattle up there in summer. I've ridden it since I was 12. Can you get her to the incident site in 2.5 hours? Torres looked at the weather display. At Lena. At the weather display again. 2 hours 15 if we go now. Voss pulled out her phone and made a call. She was on it for 90 seconds. She ended it and looked at Lena. You're authorized. Pack's in the back of the transport. What do you need specifically? Lena went to the transport and opened the rear. She worked fast, not frantic, just fast, the speed of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and where to find it. She pulled a field trauma kit, checked the contents, supplemented from a second bag. Airway kit. Needle thoracostomy supplies. Hemostatic gauze. 2 units of freeze-dried plasma. Warming blankets. A portable pulse ox that worked at altitude. She knew what Moss already had. She was building for what Moss would run out of. She was zipping the pack when Voss said, There's something else. Lena looked at her. The ambush on the convoy. Voss was choosing words again, the careful choosing. It wasn't random. The route was supposed to be unknown. Lena set the pack down. Someone gave up the route. That's what the preliminary assessment indicates. Whoever it was, they knew what Mass 7 was carrying, or who. Voss said nothing, which was confirmation. Lena picked up the pack. Then we need to get to them before whoever sent the ambush decides to finish what they started. She went to find Torres, who was already at the ATV with the engine running, and the wind off the ridge hit her face like cold water, and she swung up into the passenger seat and they moved. The trail was exactly what Torres had described, and worse, a packed dirt track that was fine in the first 4 kilometers and became progressively less fine as the elevation climbed, narrowing between stands of pine that pressed in from both sides and forcing them to slow on the switchbacks where the drop-off on the outside edge was not hypothetical. Torres drove like someone who'd done it for years, which he had, and Lena held the pack against her chest and watched the terrain and did not think about what she'd find at the end. She thought about it anyway. Chest wound, 4+ hours old, decompressed but not drained, volume running behind despite the plasma. Hypothermia compounding coagulopathy. Altitude compounding everything. A 23-year-old kid who'd spent 3 weeks being the worst student she'd ever had and then turned it around in a way she'd never quite seen before. She thought about Moss, alone up there with 4 casualties and a decompression needle that might have kinked and no comms and a ground team still hours out. She thought about the compromised route, about who knew the Mass 7 schedule, about the specific shape of information leaks in institutional systems, which she'd seen before in contexts that made this one feel less like a coincidence and more like a pattern. At the 9-kilometer mark, Torres hit the brakes. The trail ahead was blocked, not by terrain, by a vehicle, a forest green pickup, lights off, parked sideways across the track in a way that left no passage on either side. Torres said something under his breath. Lena was already looking at the tree line, both sides. The truck was angled with the deliberateness of something placed rather than parked. The front wheels turned in, the rear swung out, maximum blockage. There were no visible occupants. The windows were dark. "How old is this track?" she asked. "Nobody uses it in spring," Torres said. "Too wet. The mud season just ended maybe 2 weeks ago." "Nobody uses it in spring, except someone had driven that truck up here recently and left it." Lena said, "Kill the engine." Torres killed it. In the sudden quiet, the wind through the pines was the loudest thing, and underneath it, if you were listening for it, was something else. A sound that was too regular to be the wind and too irregular to be anything mechanical. Someone was on the ridge above them. Lena had the pack off her back and was reaching for something at the bottom of it. Not medical supplies, something else. Something Voss had put in the pack without comment and without Lena asking, which meant Voss had anticipated exactly this scenario when her satellite phone buzzed. Not a call, a text. From an unknown number, which shouldn't have been able to reach a device on this network. It said, "Turn back. They know you're coming. Moss is already out of time." Lena read the text once. Then she turned the phone face down on her thigh and looked at the blocked truck and the tree line and did the math that the situation required. Whoever sent that message knew her device number, knew this network, and knew she was on this trail. That last part was the most important piece, because it meant the information about her route had moved fast. Faster than the weather window had closed. Fast enough that someone had positioned a vehicle on an unmarked fire trail in the dark and gotten personnel into the tree line before she'd covered 9 of the 14 kilometers. Which meant whoever they were, they'd known she was coming before she'd decided to come. She looked at Torres. "Is there another way up?" He was very still, the way people went still when they understood that the situation had changed categories. "There's a drainage gully about 300 meters back. It runs parallel to the trail for maybe a kilometer, then cuts northeast. It's on foot, steep." "How steep?" "My cousin broke his ankle up there 3 years ago." "But it gets to the site." "Adds maybe 40 minutes. Comes out above the incident location, not below it." She thought about Tillman. About 4 hours and 40 minutes with a chest wound. About 40 more minutes. "Coming out above has tactical value," she said. Torres looked at the tree line. His face was doing the math that civilians did when civilians found themselves in situations that were not civilian situations. "I'm not..." He stopped. "I'm not trained for whatever this is." "I know. You drive back to the relay station and you tell Voss exactly where we are and what we found. The truck, the ridge, the text message, exactly. Can you do that? Yes. Go now. Don't use the trail lights until you're below the 6-kilometer mark. He went. She heard the ATV reverse, heard it pick up speed going downhill, and then the sound faded into the wind and the pines, and she was alone with the blocked truck and the tree line and the pack on her back. She moved into the trees on the left side of the trail, off the track, stepping over roots in the dark with the particular economy of someone who had done this before in worse conditions and with worse footwear. She found the drainage gully where Torres described it. A slot in the hillside cut by snowmelt, rocky-bottomed, maybe 4 feet wide at its narrowest. She went up. It was hard going. Not impossible, just genuinely difficult. The kind of terrain that punished shortcuts and rewarded patience, and she didn't have patience to spare. So she paid for the pace with her legs and her lungs, and once with her left hand when she grabbed a root that came loose. She caught herself. Kept moving. The gully opened onto a broad shelf at the 3,100-meter line, and she came over the lip and stopped. Below her, through the trees, she could see the convoy. 2 vehicles in the flat-bottom clearing that the fire trail crossed. The front one tilted left where the blast had collapsed the undercarriage, the second one angled against a boulder outcrop with the passenger door open. The third vehicle wasn't visible. She picked her way down the slope along the tree line, moving slowly now, taking 30 seconds for every step she would have taken in a second on flat ground, until she could see the clearing properly. Moss was kneeling beside the second vehicle's open door. She had a headlamp on, and her back to the slope, focused completely on the figure in the vehicle doorway. Tillman. Still sitting, which was good. His head was up, which was better. There was no one else visible in the clearing. But the truck on the trail below was there for a reason, and the person or people in the tree line were there for a reason, and the text message had been sent by someone who was either trying to help her or trying to make her turn back, and she didn't know which yet. She moved out of the tree line into the clearing. Moss heard her before she saw her. Spun, one hand going to her hip, and Lena said, "It's Harper. I'm coming in from the north. Don't—" She stopped because she could see Moss's face now, and Moss had been alone in the dark with 4 casualties for 5 hours, and the expression on her face was not fear exactly. It was the thing past fear that happened when you'd been managing alone long enough that the arrival of another person almost broke the composure you'd spent hours building. Moss held it together. "How did you get here?" "Drainage gully north of the trail. How is he?" "Stable-ish." Sat came up to 89 after the decom. "He's talking." She moved aside to let Lena get to the vehicle door. "His pressure is holding at 94/60. I've been checking every 15 minutes. Lena crouched in front of Tillman. He was sitting in the open doorway of the second vehicle with a thermal blanket around his shoulders and a monitor clipped to his finger. 23 years old. He looked like someone had taken 3 years off him in the last 5 hours. Gray-tinged, eyes heavy, breathing with visible effort. But breathing. "Tillman," she said. His eyes focused. "Major Harper. How are you feeling?" "Like I got shot," he said, which was not wrong, and was also a good sign because humor required reserves. "Where's it hurt?" "Right side. Under the arm. Hurts to breathe deep." "Don't breathe deep." She was already pulling the thermal blanket aside, already looking at the chest seal Moss had placed. The dressing was intact. The decompression needle, she checked the hub. The angle was marginal, but the catheter hadn't kinked fully. "Second unit of plasma?" "Running. About halfway through." She opened the pack and took out the portable pulse ox because the clip-on monitor Moss was using was a basic model and she wanted a second reading. Clipped it to his opposite hand. Waited. 88. Not better than Moss's number, but not worse. At this elevation, 88 was marginal but survivable if nothing else changed. She looked at the needle position again. "I'm going to place a proper chest drain," she told him. "It's going to be uncomfortable." "More uncomfortable than getting shot?" "Different." "Fine." She worked by headlamp. Moss held the light steady and handed her equipment when she asked for it, and Tillman made one sound when the trocar went in and then went quiet in the way of someone who had decided to manage pain by not acknowledging it, which was not the medically recommended approach, but was also not something she was going to argue with right now. She connected the improvised water seal drainage, modified from materials in the kit, not ideal, functional, and the output told her what she needed to know. Hemothorax. Moderate. He'd been bleeding into that space for hours, and the decompression had released the tension, but not the blood. He needs a thoracotomy, she said to Moss quietly. How long can he wait? She looked at the drain output, at his sat, at the temperature, which had dropped another 2 degrees since she'd started working. 90 minutes if we keep him warm and his pressure holds. 2 hours if we're lucky. Ground team is... Moss checked. They called in 40 minutes ago. 2 hours, 15. Then we need to get them moving faster. Lena stood. What happened to the third vehicle? Moss's expression shifted. Peters took it, drove the 2 civilian contractors out on the access road before we realized it was compromised. We lost comms with him about 90 minutes after he left. Peters was the team leader, injured in the initial blast. He'd put himself in a vehicle and driven out with the civilians while injured, which was either heroic or reckless, depending on whether he'd made it. No word? Nothing? She looked at the other casualties, 3 of them positioned against the first vehicle, wrapped in thermals, 2 alert and 1 sleeping in a way that she assessed quickly from a distance as pain-mediated rather than neurological. She went to each of them. The femur fracture was the serious one. The man was in his 40s, a civilian contractor named Ruiz, who'd been quiet for an hour, which Moss told her happened after he'd been verbal and increasingly agitated for the first 3. The shift from agitation to quiet in a patient with a femur fracture was not a reassuring direction. She managed the pain. She did it with what she had, which was not everything she wanted and more than nothing. Ruiz surfaced enough to tell her where it hurt, which was useful, and to tell her it was better, which was only partly true but partly was enough. Then her satellite phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time it was not a text, it was a call. She answered it. A man's voice, not a voice she recognized. You made it to the site. Who is this? Someone who sent the truck as a diversion, not a threat. A pause. The people on the ridge are gone. They left when you went into the gully. They didn't expect the north approach. She processed this. You've been watching the trail. I've been watching a lot of things. For a long time. Another pause. Major Harper. There are 3 names you need to know. The first is Raymond Colt. He's a logistics coordinator with the Millhaven County Emergency Management Office. He provided the Mass 7 route to a private security contractor 6 days ago. She moved away from the casualties, far enough that she could speak without being heard. What's the second name? Gerald Pruitt. She was quiet for a moment. Relation? Warren Pruitt's older brother. He runs a medical consulting company that contracts with 3 regional hospitals, including Callister Valley. The private security contractor the route was sold to is one of his shell companies. She looked at the mountains. They were black shapes against a sky that was beginning, very faintly, to lighten in the east. Why would a hospital administrator's brother want to compromise a military medical convoy? The convoy was carrying documentation, the voice said, not just casualties. Moss's team was also transporting a hard drive from a federal audit of medical billing irregularities at 2 of the hospitals in Pruitt's consulting network. The audit findings were destined for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver. Someone decided it was cheaper to lose the convoy than to let that drive arrive. Lena sat with that for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. The third name. Warren Pruitt. He knew about the drive. He knew what was on it. He made 2 calls the day before the convoy moved. One of them was to his brother. We have the records. Who are you? She asked. Someone who was also on the list, the voice said. Someone who decided that being on the list was better than being on the convoy. He paused. The evidence package is already with the U.S. Attorney. It was delivered 2 hours ago. We didn't need the drive. We've been building for 8 months. The convoy was a redundancy that someone got scared about. Tillman and Moss and Ruiz and everyone else in this clearing was someone's redundancy problem, she said. The words were flat. She kept them flat because the alternative was something she didn't have time for right now. Yes, I'm sorry. She ended the call. She stood in the cold dark at 3,100 meters with a chest drain she'd improvised from a field kit, a 23-year-old who needed a thoracotomy in 90 minutes, a team that had been ambushed over a hard drive, and the name Warren Pruitt sitting in her chest like a stone. She had been on administrative review for less than 24 hours. She went back to Tillman. The ground team arrived at 2 hours and 7 minutes, which was 8 minutes faster than the projected estimate, and due, she learned later, to Voss calling in a favor from a Forest Service emergency response unit that was already deployed in the range for a separate operation. 4 personnel with a proper medical kit and a collapsible litter and a communications unit that worked. The team lead was a medic named Okafor, who took one look at Lena's improvised drain and said, "That's field resourceful," which was the kind of compliment that medics gave when they were impressed but weren't going to be obvious about it. "It'll hold until you get him down," Lena said. "His SAT has been holding at 88 to 91. Pressure's stable, but he needs a thoracotomy in the next hour and a half. We have a trauma center 2 hours by road." "Then move fast." They moved. They were good. Professional, methodical, no wasted motion. They packaged Tillman in 12 minutes and started down the trail. Lena stayed with Moss while the other casualties were assessed and prepared for transport. And Moss, who had been running on operational adrenaline for 6 hours, sat down against the vehicle while Lena checked the last casualty. And didn't speak for almost 4 minutes, which was the longest silence Moss had probably kept in years. Then she said, "You came up the drainage gully." "Yes." "That's a 200-meter elevation gain in the dark on scree." "It had good handholds." Moss looked at her. Her face was tired in a way that went past physical. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been solely responsible for other people's survival for hours and has not allowed themselves to register how frightening that was. "I thought the comms were just weather," she said. "I didn't know about the ambush until—" She stopped. "Until Okafor's team told me on the way in." "There's more to it than the ambush," Lena said. "Voss will brief you when you're out." "Is it—" Moss started and then stopped and then said, "Is it someone at the hospital?" Lena looked at her. Moss was 29 and she had good instincts, and she'd been thinking while she worked, the way smart people couldn't stop themselves from thinking, even when the situation demanded they do nothing but manage the immediate problem. "Part of it is," Lena said. Moss absorbed that, looked at her hands, which were dirty and steady. "You've been nursing in Millhaven for 8 months." "Yes." "And before that?" "Before that was before that," Lena said. "Come on. We need to move." They were off the mountain by 0700. Lena went in the last transport vehicle, which was a cramped Forest Service truck with a heater that worked on the right side only. She sat against the door and felt the cold from the window and did not sleep. Voss was at the relay station when they arrived. She looked at Lena the way people looked at people who had done something they'd asked them not to do and produced an outcome they were grateful for, which was a particular look that had no clean name. She handed Lena a coffee and a thermos and said, "Tillman's in surgery in Glenwood Springs. They say he's going to make it." Lena took the coffee. "What about Peters?" "Made it out. Drove the civilian contractors to the highway and flagged down a semi. He's got a grade 2 concussion and a fractured wrist. He drove out with a fractured wrist." "That sounds like Peters." "It does." Voss sat down across from her. Outside, the mountains were fully lit now, gold going to the particular sharp blue of high-altitude late morning. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver executed search warrants this morning. 3 locations. Gerald Pruitt's consulting firm, a private security company called Blackridge Meridian, and, she paused, and Callister Valley Medical Center, specifically the administrative offices. Lena set the coffee down. "Warren Pruitt. He was the one who told his brother about the audit and the convoy. The billing irregularities go back 4 years. Callister Valley is one of 3 hospitals in the consulting network. We're talking about 8 figures in fraudulent Medicare billing, Lena. The convoy was a panic move. They thought losing the drive bought them time. What they didn't know was that the federal team had already imaged the drive contents before it was loaded. So the ambush was pointless. The ambush was 3 felonies and a conspiracy charge on top of a fraud case that was already airtight. Voss looked at her without expression. Warren Pruitt was taken into custody at 7:42 this morning at Callister Valley Medical Center. His administrative privileges were suspended by the hospital board within the hour, pending the criminal investigation. He hasn't been charged yet. That'll take a day or two for the paperwork, but his attorney was already at the county jail before 8 o'clock. Lena was quiet for a moment. She thought about the folder on his desk, the 2 chairs, the parking structure view from his window, the way he'd said, "You are not a physician in a corridor full of people." "The hospital board knows about the billing?" she asked. "They're cooperating." The board chair released a statement at 8:15. "Full cooperation with federal authorities, administrative review of all affiliated contracts, Pruitt's suspension effective immediately pending outcome." Voss paused. "The CMO is also under review. He's not a target of the fraud investigation, but he may have been willfully blind to some of the billing practices." "What about the administrative review he filed against me?" "Withdrawn this morning. The HR director called me 40 minutes ago. Apparently the board's outside counsel advised them that pursuing a disciplinary action against a nurse, while the department chief is in federal custody for crimes related to his hospital activities, created a specific kind of institutional exposure that they were not interested in having." Voss allowed herself a small, dry expression. The HR director used the phrase timing considerations. Lena almost laughed. She didn't quite get there. "Paige Aller," she said. "What about her?" "Pruitt said he was going to put her through a review for the ultrasound order. She stood in a hallway in front of everyone and ordered that exam on a kid who needed it, knowing it was going to cost her." "I'll flag it," Voss said. "That's a hospital matter, not ours, but I'll flag it to the board's outside counsel." Lena nodded. She picked up the coffee again. It was lukewarm now, but she drank it anyway. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, the silence of 2 people who had been working toward the same end by different routes and had arrived at the same place and didn't need to narrate it. Then Voss said, "There's a conversation we need to have." "About?" "About what comes next." Voss put her hands flat on the table. "The program you left, MAST and the training architecture you built around it, has been running on the protocols you wrote. It's been running adequately. What last night demonstrated and what this morning demonstrated is what it looks like when there's a gap between adequately and what it needs to be." She looked at Lena directly. "We've had 6 field actions in the last 14 months where the outcome came down to whether the medic on the ground had been trained to your standard or to the standard that replaced it. In 4 of those 6, the outcome was worse than it should have been." Lena didn't ask which 4. She knew that if she asked, she'd have 4 more things to carry. "The program needs restructuring," Voss said. "Not the protocols. The protocols are sound, the training pipeline, the scenario design, the way we evaluate whether a medic is genuinely ready versus technically compliant." She paused. "That's not something that gets fixed with a memo or a consultant. It requires someone who built the original framework and understands where the gaps are from the inside." "You're asking me to come back?" "I'm asking you to consider it." Lena looked at the mountains through the relay station's one small window. The gold blue of morning was moving toward midday white, the light flattening, the shadows shortening. She thought about the 8 months in Millhaven, the asthmatic kid Marcus, whose peak flow had been dropping, the woman with the STEMI who'd presented as fatigue, Cody, with his left-sided tenderness and his bruising and his careful small gesture toward the pain. She thought about Paige Aller saying, "I'll order it in a corridor full of people who were all waiting to see what she would do." "There's a condition," Lena said. Voss waited. "I finish my shift at Callister Valley. I give proper notice. 2 weeks minimum." She looked at Voss. "I don't leave a department in chaos because something more important came along. That's not how I do things." Voss nodded slowly. "That's manageable. And Aller gets cleared, in writing, before the end of the week. I'll make the call today." Lena set down the empty thermos. She was about to say something else when her phone buzzed. Not the satellite unit, her personal phone. The number was Callister Valley's main line. She answered it. The voice on the other end was not a voice she recognized. A woman, formal, introducing herself as the hospital board's interim administrator. She said the phrase "sincere institutional apology" within the first 30 seconds, which was exactly as hollow as institutional apologies always were. She said that the board was committed to a thorough review of departmental culture and management practices. She said Lena's clinical record was exemplary and that the administrative review initiated by Dr. Pruitt was being formally expunged from her file. Lena let the woman finish. Then she said, "I'll be in for my next scheduled shift." There was a brief pause on the other end, as if the board's interim administrator had prepared for a different kind of conversation. "Of course. We look forward to—" "There's a patient in the PICU named Cody," Lena said. "Can you make sure his care team has everything they need?" Another pause. "Absolutely." She ended the call. Voss was watching her. "Exemplary clinical record," she said. "That's the same hospital that put you on administrative review 14 hours ago." "Yes," Lena said. "It is." She stood up. She had a 3-hour drive back to Millhaven, a night's sleep she hadn't gotten, and a shift in 26 hours. She picked up the pack, lighter now, most of its contents distributed across a mountainside and a trauma bay and a 23-year-old's chest cavity. She was at the door when Voss said, "The text message, the one on the trail, the third name. You said the caller gave you 3 names. Colt, Gerald Pruitt, Warren Pruitt. Was there a third?" Lena had not said that to Voss. She'd told her about the call, but not the content in detail. The fact that Voss knew there were 3 names meant Voss had been in contact with whoever made the call, which meant the call had not come from an outside party. It had come from Voss's network, a controlled disclosure timed for the trail, designed to give Lena exactly the information she needed at exactly the moment she needed it, including the name Warren Pruitt, so that when she came off the mountain she would already know. She turned around. "You knew," Lena said. "You've known about Warren Pruitt for longer than this morning." Voss met her eyes and didn't flinch. "The federal investigation has been running for 6 months. We've been aware of the hospital connection for 3. You placed me at Callister Valley. We were aware of an opening at Callister Valley that fit your background." Lena stood in the doorway and looked at the woman across the table. Diane Voss, whose title had changed 3 times but whose function had not, who had driven through the night to deliver information in person, who had a vehicle ready downstairs and a pack already assembled. "Was any of it real?" Lena asked. "The transfer, the position, the 8 months. The nursing was real," Voss said. "Everything you did in that building was real. The patients were real. Cody was real." She paused. "We needed someone in that hospital who could see clearly and who couldn't be managed or threatened out of seeing clearly. That's not manufactured. That's just you." Lena looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, 2 weeks' notice, Aller's clearance in writing, and the next time you put me somewhere, you tell me." Voss said, "Agreed." Lena walked out into the mountain morning. She got in the car. She drove. Halfway down the ridge road, her phone buzzed with a message from a Callister Valley number she recognized. Darla Fusco's cell, not the hospital line. It said, "Pruitt got walked out in handcuffs at 7:42. Whole department saw it. Aller's been asked to cover the acute bays. Thought you should know." And below that, after a pause she could infer from the timestamp, "Also, Cody's mom asked about you. Said to say thank you." Lena read it, put the phone on the passenger seat, kept driving. The mountains were enormous and indifferent on both sides of the road, the way they always were, the way they'd been long before any of this and would be long after. She drove through the valley where the light was already shifting toward afternoon, and she thought about Tillman in surgery, and Moss somewhere in a debriefing room, and Aller in the acute bays doing the work that needed doing. She thought about Voss saying we needed someone who couldn't be managed or threatened out of seeing clearly, and how that was true, and how it was also a way of using someone, and how both of those things could be true at the same time, and how the space between them was something she was going to have to decide how to live in. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize, a different one than the trail call, a 202 area code, Washington. She let it ring. It rang 6 times. Stopped. Then immediately started again. She picked it up. A man's voice, not Briggs, not the trail caller, older, with the particular cadence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where decisions were made and had stopped needing to perform authority because he simply had it. "Major Harper, my name is Garrett Ellison. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Federal Emergency Medical Preparedness. We've been watching the last 18 hours very carefully." A pause. "I'd like to talk to you about something that goes considerably beyond the MAST program. She let the silence run for exactly as long as it needed to, which was about 4 seconds, and then she said, "Deputy Secretary Ellison, I'm going to need more than a phone call." A pause on the other end. Not displeasure, recalibration. "Of course. When are you available?" "2 weeks from Thursday. I have obligations I'm finishing first." "We'll make it work." His voice carried the particular quality of someone who had learned over a long career that the people worth waiting for were worth waiting for. "My office will be in touch with logistics." She ended the call. Put the phone on the seat. Drove the rest of the way into Millhaven with the mountains going gold on both sides and the valley floor coming up to meet her. And she didn't make any decisions yet because 2 weeks was enough time to make decisions, and right now what she needed was sleep and food and the specific restoration that came from returning to the ordinary after too many hours inside the extraordinary. She parked, climbed the stairs to her apartment, stood at the kitchen window for a moment, and looked at the mountains, which were doing what they always did, being enormous and indifferent, and in their indifference somehow stabilizing. Then she went to bed. She slept 9 hours without interruption, which was the longest unbroken sleep she'd had in 4 months, and she woke up to a Thursday morning that was ordinary in every external detail. Light through the curtains, the sound of a delivery truck on the street below, the smell of nothing because she hadn't made coffee yet. She lay still for a while and let the ordinary be ordinary, because she had learned over years of extraordinary situations that the ordinary was not a lesser state. It was the thing you were trying to protect. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened her phone and read the news. The U.S. Attorney's press release had gone out at 6:15 that morning. She read it 3 times, not because it was difficult to understand, but because the specificity of it mattered, and she wanted the specificity to land fully. Warren Pruitt had been charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 1 count of conspiracy to interfere with federal personnel in the conduct of their duties. The 3rd charge had been added because of the convoy, because what had happened on that mountain road at 2 in the morning was not separable from what Warren Pruitt had known and what he had communicated to his brother, and the federal prosecutors had built the connection with documented call records and financial transfers and a cooperation agreement from Raymond Colt that apparently ran to 67 pages. Gerald Pruitt's company, Blackridge Meridian, had been named in a civil asset forfeiture proceeding filed simultaneously. 3 shell accounts, a total of approximately $400,000 in payments traced back to the billing fraud network over 26 months. The hospital board's statement, released at 7 o'clock, ran longer than the attorney's press release. It covered 4 specific points: full cooperation with federal authorities, suspension of all contracts affiliated with the Pruitt Consulting Network, establishment of an independent patient safety review going back 5 years, and the creation of a permanent clinical ethics reporting mechanism with external oversight. The last point was the one that mattered most, because it meant the mechanism for what had happened. The mechanism by which a department chief could suppress clinical concerns for 11 years without institutional consequence was being formally dismantled and replaced with something that didn't depend on individuals being willing to stand in a corridor alone. She read the board statement twice. She noted that it used the word accountability 7 times, which was either genuine or performative and probably some ratio of both, the way these things usually were. She noted that it did not mention her name, which was correct. The point was never to be in the statement. The point was what the statement described. She put the phone down and finished her coffee. She went back to Callister Valley that morning, not because she was scheduled. She'd already given notice, and her next shift wasn't until Friday, but because there was something she needed to see with her own eyes rather than read about on a screen. The department looked like a department that had been through something and was figuring out what came next. The nursing staff moved with a quality she recognized, the slightly over-deliberate motion of people who had recalibrated their sense of what was safe to say and do and were still testing the new parameters. 3 nurses she'd never seen particularly animated were standing near the medication cart having a conversation that looked, from a distance, like the kind of conversation that departments had when the thing that had been preventing a certain category of conversation was no longer there. Darla was at the charge desk. She looked at Lena the way she always looked at her, directly, without performance, taking in what was actually there rather than what she expected to see. "You look like you slept." "I did." "Good. You looked like death yesterday." Darla handed her a coffee from the station pot, which was a gesture that meant something specific at Callister Valley, because the station pot was guarded with the particular territorial intensity that nursing staffs reserved for communal resources. "Board sent an all-staff email this morning." I read the public statement. The internal one was different, more specific. Darla leaned on the counter. "They're naming an interim CMO by next week, and the HR director called the nursing union rep this morning to schedule a meeting about the documentation policies." "Which policies?" "All of them, apparently, starting with the ones that made it procedurally difficult to document clinical disagreements with attending physicians." Darla said it without particular emphasis, the way she said most things, but the meaning underneath it was not without weight. For 11 years, the documentation system at Callister Valley had been structured in a way that made formal disagreement difficult, which was not an accident and was not something that fixed itself. That it was being addressed now was a direct consequence of what had been pulled into the light, and they both knew it. "Where's Aller?" Lena asked. "Acute bays. She's been running them since yesterday. Asked to." Darla looked at her. "She's good." "I know." She found Aller between patients, reviewing labs on a tablet with the focused efficiency of someone who'd found their footing in the last 48 hours and was running on it. Aller looked up when Lena appeared in the doorway, and something in her face did a complicated thing. Relief and uncertainty, and something that was working towards steadiness but wasn't there yet. "You're back," Aller said. 2 weeks' notice," Lena said. "I worked them." Aller set down the tablet. She was quiet for a moment, and Lena waited, because Aller was someone who needed a beat before she said the real thing. "I got a call from the board's outside counsel yesterday afternoon." "I know." "They said the ultrasound order was documented as appropriate clinical escalation and no further review would occur." She paused. "They said it had been flagged by someone outside the hospital." "I mentioned it to someone." "Thank you," Aller said. Then, because she was honest in the way that residents were sometimes honest before the system finished teaching them not to be, "I was scared when I ordered it. I want you to know that. I didn't do it because I wasn't scared. I did it because I was more scared of the alternative." Lena looked at her. "That's the only reason that matters. Is it always going to feel like that?" "Like what?" "Like you're stepping off something with no guarantee there's ground under it." Lena thought about the honest answer. "The feeling changes," she said. "It doesn't go away, but it changes. You get better at recognizing the difference between the fear that's telling you something's wrong and the fear that's just telling you that doing the right thing costs something." She paused. "The second kind is just the price of admission. You learn to pay it without letting it make the decision for you." Aller absorbed that. "Is that what you were doing? Yesterday morning, with Cody?" "I was doing my job," Lena said. "The rest of it was just consequence." She went back to the floor and worked the morning. She wasn't scheduled, and she told Darla that clearly, but there were enough bodies needed that her presence was practically useful, and she preferred practical usefulness to sitting in her apartment thinking about conversations she hadn't had yet. She worked the secondary corridor, the same corridor she'd been assigned to for 6 months, and she did it with the same attention she'd always brought, and the department moved around her in a way that felt different than it had 8 months ago. Less friction, more air, the quality of a room where a window had been opened after a long time closed. At mid-morning, she was discharging a 22-year-old with a mild concussion when Darla appeared in the doorway and said quietly, "Cody's family is asking about you. They're upstairs, pediatric pod." His mother called the nursing station. She finished the discharge. Then she went upstairs. Cody was sitting up in bed with 3 get-well cards taped to the wall beside him, and a tablet propped on his knees showing something she couldn't identify from the doorway. He looked, compared to the last time she'd seen him, like a different version of the same child. Color in his face, eyes clear, the specific energy of a kid who was bored by recovery and ready to be done with it. His mother was in the chair she'd apparently occupied for most of the last 10 days, a woman in her early 30s named Renata, who had the look of someone who had not slept sufficiently for over a week, but had decided that insufficient sleep was a completely acceptable trade. When Cody saw Lena, he said, with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to lead with small talk, "The doctor said you found the bleeding." "I did," she said. "Before the other doctor." "Yes." He considered this with the gravity of someone processing new information about how adults worked. "My mom said you got in trouble for it." Renata made a soft sound. "Cody?" "A little," Lena said. "But it worked out." "The doctor who got you in trouble got arrested," Cody said. Not with satisfaction, with the particular matter-of-fact quality of a child reporting a thing that seemed to him logically consistent with the information he had. "That was about different things," Lena said. "But still." He looked at her steadily. "You were right, and he was wrong, and then he got arrested." She did not argue with this summary of events. Renata stood up from the chair and came to Lena and took her hand the way she had in the corridor, the two-handed grip that communicated everything the available sentences couldn't organize. "I don't know how to," she started, and then stopped, because there was no completion that was adequate, and she knew it. "He's my whole life," she said. "And you?" She stopped again. "He's going to be fine," Lena said. "He's going to go home and eat too much sugar and drive you crazy, and that's exactly what should happen." Renata laughed, which broke some of the pressure that had been building in the room, and Cody said, "Mom," in the tone of a child who found parental emotion professionally embarrassing, and for a moment the hospital room was just a room where a family was relieved, which was the best thing a room in a hospital could be. Before she left, Cody said, "Are you going to keep working here?" "A little longer," she said, "and then somewhere else." "Somewhere more important?" She thought about that. "Somewhere different. Whether it's more important depends on where you're standing." He nodded, processing this the way he processed things, thoroughly, without rushing. "My dad says that the most important job is the one where somebody needs you most." "Your dad's right," she said. "Tell him I said so." She walked out of the room and stood in the corridor for a moment. The pediatric pod had the specific quality of all pediatric pods: the slightly too bright colors, the artwork on the walls, the effort to make an inherently frightening place feel less frightening, which was an imperfect effort that was worth making. Down the hall, someone was laughing. A nurse was talking to a small girl in a paper gown, keeping her voice light and making the girl lean toward it. The ordinary machinery of care, running the way it always ran, imperfect and necessary, and continuously dependent on the particular people who showed up to run it. She took the stairs back down. Blah. Her last 2 weeks at Callister Valley were ordinary in the way that final chapters of things were sometimes ordinary. Not reduced, not diminished, just themselves, without the weight of what came after pressing down on them yet. She worked her shifts. She moved through the corridors and the bays and the triage desk and the secondary corridor that had been her assigned territory for 6 months. She did the work the same way she'd always done it, because the work didn't change based on how many days were left on the calendar. She watched things change around her in ways that were incremental and therefore easy to underestimate if you weren't paying attention. The interim CMO candidate made 2 visits to the department during the last week. A woman named Dr. Yvonne Farber, who had trained in Pittsburgh and had the particular manner of someone who had genuine opinions about things and was accustomed to saying them. On her second visit, she spent 40 minutes with the nursing staff asking questions and taking notes, and not, notably, talking over people who were answering her questions. That was not a small thing. The documentation policy revision went through a first draft by the end of the 2nd week. Lena read it on the internal portal, not because she was part of the revision committee, but because the nursing union rep had forwarded it to all staff for feedback. The new policy created a formal mechanism for clinical concern documentation that didn't require a supervising physician's counter-signature, a change that sounded procedural and was, in practice, the difference between a nurse being able to create a formal record of a clinical disagreement and being told to put it through a chain that could suppress it. She submitted 1 page of feedback. She didn't know if it would be incorporated. She submitted it anyway. On her last Thursday, the regional news ran a follow-up piece on the Pruitt case. Warren Pruitt had made a brief statement through his attorney. a statement that expressed no acknowledgement of harm and a great deal of language about due process, which was his right and also exactly what she'd expected. Gerald Pruitt's cooperation agreement had produced, according to the piece, a sealed document that the federal investigators described as materially significant to the ongoing case. Raymond Colt had completed his cooperation deposition. The trial date, when set, would likely be 8 to 14 months out. She read the piece once, closed the browser, and went back to her shift. There were things she felt about Warren Pruitt that were not simple. She'd thought about this during the 2 weeks, in the small spaces between patients and tasks and handoffs, and what she'd arrived at was not satisfaction and not quite the absence of it either. What she felt was something closer to the particular tiredness that came after a long situation finally resolved. Not relief, because relief implied that the difficulty was over, and the difficulty was never over, it just changed shape. More like the feeling of having carried something a long distance and setting it down. The thing was still there. She'd just stopped being the one carrying it. What Pruitt had done to her specifically, the documentation warnings, the administrative review, the public diminishments in corridors with audiences, those were real things, and they had cost her real things, and she didn't minimize that. But what he'd done to the system around him over 11 years in ways that were much harder to quantify. The nurses who'd stopped flagging things because the cost was too high, the residents who'd learned to defer rather than advocate, the patients who'd gotten the outcome of all that accumulated silence. That was the thing that had weight. The thing that had weight wasn't what had happened to her. It was what had happened through her absence, through the absence of anyone who would say the thing that needed saying, regardless of the cost. That was the actual damage of people like Pruitt, not the specific acts. The specific acts were prosecutable, and they were being prosecuted. The actual damage was what his presence had trained people around him not to do. That damage was slower to repair than a fraud case, slower than a court date, slower than a federal settlement. It repaired itself one decision at a time, one person at a time, in corridors where someone stood up and said the thing and the world didn't end. She thought about Aller saying, "I'll order it a second time," in a voice that was steadier than the first. One person at a time. Her last shift ended at 7 in the evening on a Wednesday. She finished her handoffs, changed out of her scrubs, folded them the way she always folded them, and put her stethoscope in her bag. She sat on the locker room bench for a moment, not collapsing, not making it a moment, just the natural pause of someone transitioning between one thing and the next. The stethoscope was 11 years old. The tubing was good. She'd replaced the ear tips twice. She'd carried it through places that had no name in any report and through 8 months of a triage corridor in Millhaven, Colorado, and it had done what it was designed to do every time she'd needed it to. She put it in the bag. Darla was at the charge desk when she came out. The evening shift was running, the board populated with the usual Wednesday evening volume, and the department had the particular rhythm of a department that was finding its way back to itself. Not perfectly, not quickly, but genuinely. Darla handed her a small envelope. "From the nursing staff, don't open it here." Lena took it. "Thank you," she said, "for everything that is encompassed by 16 months. 8 months, Darla said. "The work," Lena said, "not the time." Darla looked at her for a moment with the direct, unvarnished look that was the most honest form of regard she'd ever encountered in a professional setting. "You gonna come back through?" "Probably. This is a good hospital. It just needed a different direction." "It's getting one," Darla said. "Slowly." "Slowly is how things actually change," Lena said. "The fast ones don't hold." She walked out through the ambulance bay. The Colorado evening was cold and clear, the stars already visible at the horizon where the light had drained from the sky fastest. She stood in the cold for a moment and breathed it. In the car, she opened the envelope. The card had 17 signatures. She read each one. At the bottom, in Paige Aller's clear, deliberate handwriting, "You showed me what it looks like to do the hard thing without making it about yourself. I won't forget it. I'll try to pass it on." She sat with that for a long time. Then she started the car. She met Garrett Ellison in person 3 weeks later. in a federal building in Washington with the institutional gravity of a place where significant decisions had been made for a long time. The meeting ran 4 hours, which was 2 hours past the scheduled block, because the second hour produced a disagreement about the scope of the director's authority over hospital credentialing during declared federal disasters, and she wasn't willing to accept the position without that authority, and she said so without softening it. Ellison looked at her across the table. That's a significant ask. Credentialing authority crosses into civilian hospital jurisdiction in ways that require HHS coordination. Then coordinate with HHS, she said. The reason outcomes break down at the civilian-military intersection is that nobody has clear authority over the room. You can't fix that by creating another role without authority. You just add another person who can be overridden. The hospitals will push back. Some of them will. The ones that are operating well won't, because the ones that are operating well already give their clinical staff the authority to make calls. The ones that push back are the ones that need the oversight most. She paused. I've spent 8 months inside a hospital that had no mechanism for clinical concerns to survive contact with administrative authority. I know what that produces. I'm not building a program that replicates it at a federal level. Ellison was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who had been told things he didn't want to hear many times, and had long ago made his peace with the fact that the things he didn't want to hear were often the things he needed to. He picked up his pen. Give me the specific scope you need. In writing. I'll take it to HHS and see what we can build. They worked for another 90 minutes. The scope they arrived at was not everything she'd asked for, and more than she'd expected, which was roughly how these things went when both parties were operating in good faith. The authority over credentialing during declared disasters was granted with a 6-month review clause, which she accepted because 6 months was enough time to demonstrate that the authority was being used correctly, and the review clause was something she could work with. She signed the appointment documents on a Thursday afternoon with Voss in the back of the room, which was a kind of presence Lena had come to understand as Voss's version of witness. Afterward, in the hallway, Voss said, "How does it feel?" "Ask me in a year," Lena said, "when I know if I've changed anything that holds." "You changed things at Callister Valley." "I found one child's internal bleeding and stood next to a junior doctor while she made a call she was going to make anyway. She said it straight. The structural things take longer. That's why they need someone who doesn't quit when they take longer," Voss said. Lena didn't answer that directly, because it was true, and she knew it was true, and saying so felt like something she hadn't earned yet, or hadn't earned enough of yet to state as fact. They stood in the federal building hallway with the institutional hum of a building that was always running, and outside the Washington afternoon was the specific gray of a city that didn't do weather dramatically, and Lena thought about what she was about to go build and how long it would take, and how many things would go wrong before they went right. She was not afraid of that. She had the specific quality of person who found long, difficult work clarifying rather than discouraging, who functioned better inside a problem that had real dimensions than inside a situation that was comfortable. That was not a virtue she'd cultivated. It was just how she was made, and she'd spent enough time fighting it to know that fighting it was the wrong use of the energy. The first Federal Trauma Integration Command training session ran 6 weeks after her appointment in a converted conference center in Colorado Springs that had the advantage of being geographically central and the disadvantage of fluorescent lighting that had been installed in what appeared to be the early 90s and not updated since. 14 people. 7 military medics from 4 different units. 7 civilian EMTs and trauma nurses from 3 different state emergency systems. They came from different cultures and different chains of command and different assumptions about what field medicine looked like and who was in charge of it. And one of the primary tasks of the first week was creating the conditions under which those assumptions could be examined without the people holding them feeling like they were being asked to abandon their training. She built the curriculum herself, working backward from the specific failure points in 4 years of massed operational data, the moments where outcomes had diverged from what the protocols predicted, and why. The pattern that emerged from that analysis was consistent enough to be a diagnosis. People in the field were making deferential decisions when they should have been making clinical ones. Not because they didn't know the right clinical answer, because the systems they operated in had trained them to subordinate clinical knowledge to hierarchical position. And in the field, when the hierarchy was compromised or unavailable or simply wrong, that training became a liability. She spent 3 days on the decision architecture, not the medical technique, the framework for recognizing when your clinical read diverged from the official assessment and what to do with that divergence in real time, under pressure, in front of other people, with professional consequences attached to the choice. On the second day, a medic named Desjardins raised her hand. 26, Army, from Louisiana, with the particular sharpness of someone who'd thought about things more carefully than the system had necessarily encouraged. "What you're describing," she said, "it sounds like training us to go against our chain of command. It's training you to know the difference between following a chain of command and deferring to a chain of command when the chain is wrong," Lena said. "Those are different things. Following a chain that's right is appropriate structure. Deferring to a chain that's wrong because the cost of being right is too high. That's where people die." "How do you know when the chain is wrong?" "You don't always," Lena said. "Sometimes you're the one who's wrong. That happens. That's part of the cost." She looked around the room, 14 people who were giving her the specific quality of attention that came from recognizing that what was being said was real. The framework isn't designed to make you certain. It's designed to help you make the call anyway, without certainty, and to make it in a way that creates a record, so that when you're right, it's documented, and when you're wrong, you can learn from it rather than just absorbing the consequences. A civilian EMT named Birch from a Denver trauma system said, "In the civilian side, we have incident command structures. They're pretty clear about authority." "They're clear about authority in standard incidents," Lena said. "What happens when the incident commander is down? Or when the incident has crossed a jurisdictional line that the command structure wasn't built for? Or when you have information the commander doesn't have and you can't reach them and someone is dying in the next 30 seconds? Birch looked at her. "Then you do what needs doing and you document it afterward." "Yes," Lena said. "That's exactly right. That's the decision. The training is for the 45 seconds before you make it, when everything in your professional background is telling you to wait for authorization that isn't coming." She paused. "That's the 45 seconds we're going to work on this week." She thought briefly about an ultrasound machine in a Millhaven corridor, about the weight of a clipboard being set down on a counter, about the specific quality of silence in a hallway full of people who were waiting to see which way things went, about the first time Aller said, "I'll order it," and the second time being steadier, the steadiness built on the fact of having done it once. The training was not the story. The training was what you built from the story after it was over, so that other people didn't have to start from scratch in the dark, on a mountain in the middle of their own version of the same situation. Wade Tillman was discharged from the Glenwood Springs Trauma Center on a Tuesday morning, 22 days after the convoy. Moss sent a photograph. Tillman standing at the hospital exit in civilian clothes, holding a coffee cup with the expression of a man who had strong opinions about the coffee, but was choosing not to articulate them, which was exactly the expression Lena remembered from the last week of his training when he'd been performing at the highest level of the cohort, but hadn't wanted to be observed performing at the highest level of the cohort, because something in him resisted being seen doing well the way other people resisted being seen struggling. She texted Moss, "Tell him the EJ was textbook." Moss replied 40 seconds later. "He says he'd prefer you hadn't needed to place one. Also, he says thank you." He said it exactly once, and then immediately changed the subject. "That sounds right," Lena texted back. "How are you?" A longer pause this time, then, "Tired. Good tired. The kind where you know what you're tired from." "Rest," Lena replied. "You earned it." She put the phone away and went back to the work. What? The work was long and specific and frequently unglamorous. It involved meetings and budget negotiations and jurisdictional arguments with HHS coordinators who had legitimate concerns that needed to be addressed rather than dismissed, and it involved 3 curriculum rewrites over the first 8 weeks because the first version was too abstract, and the second version was too procedural, and the third version was the one that said what she was actually trying to say. It involved a political situation in month 3 when a senator from a western state raised concerns about the credentialing authority clause, and she spent 2 days in Washington making the case in rooms that were uncomfortable and took her case seriously, which was the best outcome she could have expected. It involved, in month 4, a field action in Wyoming where a FTIC-trained medic named Okafor was the only qualified person on site when a multi-vehicle accident on a mountain highway produced 6 casualties and a compromised incident command structure. And Okafor made 3 clinical decisions that diverged from the initial assessment and documented all 3 in real time, and all 3 were subsequently validated, and all 6 casualties survived. She read the after-action report 3 times. She didn't celebrate it. She added it to the operational data and looked for what it told her about what needed to be built next. The work was not the story. The story was over. The work was what came after the story, in the long middle of the thing, where the dramatic moments were rare and the daily decisions were the actual substance of whether anything changed. She was good at the long middle. She had always been good at the long middle. The dramatic moments got the attention, but the long middle was where the decisions that held were made, one at a time, without an audience, by people who showed up and did the specific work in front of them without waiting for the moment to arrive that would prove it was worth doing. 6 months after her appointment, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, she got a call from Darla Fusco. Not a hospital call, Darla's personal cell. Lena was in her Washington office, which was a small room with a window that looked onto a courtyard, and enough space for a desk and 2 chairs and a whiteboard that was currently covered in curriculum flow diagrams. "Cody's back," Darla said. "Not medically. His mom brought him in to visit. He asked if you still worked here." Lena leaned back in her chair. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you'd moved on to something bigger. He asked what bigger meant. I said I didn't entirely know, but that you'd gone somewhere you were needed more." "Did he accept that?" "He thought about it for a while," Darla said. "Then he said that his dad says the most important job is the one where somebody needs you most. And if you'd gone somewhere people needed you more, then that was the right place to be." Lena was quiet for a moment. "He also said to tell you he still thinks about the fact that you argued with the doctor," Darla said. "Not the clinical thing, just that you did it. He said his teacher is kind of like that doctor, and when she's unfair, he tries to think about what you did." "What does he do?" "He argues," Darla said. "Politely, but he argues." Lena looked out the window at the courtyard where a tree was doing the first tentative work of spring. A few early leaves on the upper branches, the rest of it still bare. The whole tree in the middle of becoming something it would take another month to fully be. "Tell him that's exactly right," she said. "Tell him to keep doing that." She ended the call and sat for a moment in the small office with the whiteboard full of curriculum diagrams and the courtyard tree outside the window and the particular quality of a Tuesday morning that was not dramatic and not remarkable and was, for those reasons, the most honest representation of what the work actually was. She had spent 3 years trying to be only Lena Caldwell, the quiet nurse in the triage corridor, the woman who showed up early and stayed late and flagged things through appropriate channels, and kept her history and a part of herself she didn't open in public. She had done that because she needed the rest. Because the person she'd been before needed the quiet, needed the ordinary, needed the distance from the kind of stakes where the cost of getting it wrong was measured in people. She didn't regret the 3 years. She regretted nothing about Cody, or Marcus, or the woman with the STEMI in the corridor who was alive in some house somewhere, driving her kids to school or complaining about her commute, or doing whatever people did when they'd come close to something final and had been pulled back from it by someone noticing the right thing at the right moment. She regretted nothing about Aller, or about the 45 seconds in a hallway that had been, for Aller, the beginning of a different way of practicing medicine. She regretted nothing about Moss, who had placed an external jugular line in a 30-mile-per-hour wind with cold hands and no one to tell her she could do it except someone on a satellite phone at 49% signal, and who had done it because the alternative was not doing it, and not doing it was not a choice she was willing to make. She regretted nothing about the drainage gully, or Tillman, or the mountain morning when she'd driven down the Ridge Road and read Darla's text about Pruitt being walked out in handcuffs at 7:42, and had felt not triumph but the specific, quiet rightness of a system correcting itself. Imperfectly, too slowly, with the usual inadequacy of institutional reckonings, but genuinely. What she had been, before the 3 years, had built the things that mattered. What she had learned during the 3 years had changed how she understood what she'd built, and what it was still missing. The 2 versions of herself were not in conflict. They were the same person at different distances from the same truth, which was simply that the work mattered more than the position, and the outcome mattered more than the acknowledgement, and the thing you knew needed doing, regardless of who was in the room watching you do it. She picked up a marker, went to the whiteboard. The curriculum flow diagram had a gap in it that she'd been thinking about for 3 days, a section on real-time documentation under pressure that wasn't yet doing what it needed to do. She found the gap and started revising. The tree outside the window kept doing its slow work. She kept doing hers. Neither of them was finished. Neither of them needed to be yet. The becoming was the thing, not the arrival, not the moment of recognition, not the title on the appointment document, or the charges filed, or the name cleared from a disciplinary file. Those were consequences of the work, not the work itself. The work was this: showing up, seeing clearly, saying the thing, making the call, and then getting up the next day and doing it again, without waiting for the moment to arrive that proved it had been worth doing. Because by the time you knew it had been worth doing, you'd already been doing it for years. And somewhere, a kid named Cody was arguing with his teacher, politely, because someone had shown him what it looked like when you did it. Not the victory, not the vindication, just the act of looking at what was in front of you and saying the true thing regardless of what it cost. That was the only inheritance that lasted. She finished the revision, stepped back, looked at it. Better. She put the cap on the marker and went back to work.